Hello, we welcome you to today's Bible study of the Banking Blessings Ministry. Today we are going to look at an event that occurred during the reign of David, but actually started during when Israelites were on the Exodus, moving out of Egypt and moving towards the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua. The Gibeonites made a peace treaty with Israel, and Saul violated this peace treaty, and during the period of David, Israel faced 3 years of continuous famine. So we'll look at the interactions that occurred and learn some lessons from it. We will learn that, as I said, that Israel during the time of David went through 3 consecutive years of famine because Saul violated a peace treaty that they made with the Gibeonites during the period that Joshua was leading the Israelites towards the Promised Land. In order to solve the problem, David had to make a sacrifice to the Gibeonites. They demanded 7 male descendants of Saul, and David gave to them, and they killed them and exposed them. We will look at the details. But through this, the mother of 2 of the sons, Rizpah, a concubine of Saul, gathered the bodies day and night through the harvest period. And we learn a very useful lesson here about guarding your sacrifice, about when you make a contribution, to do your best to see that contribution to its ultimate goal. Everything we learn today will be from 2 Samuel chapter 21 and Joshua chapter 9. We will begin with the famine in Israel that occurred during 3 successive years during the reign of David. David, as usual, prayed, he inquired from God, he asked God what was going on, and God told him that the famine was a punishment to Israel because Saul attacked the Gibeonites and tried to annihilate them against a promise that the Israelites made to the Gibeonites under God when the Israelites were being led to the Promised Land by Joshua. Let us read about this in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 to 2. 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 1. During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now, the Gibeonites were not a part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. So this was a promise, or rather, in fact, a peace treaty that the people of Israel made with the Gibeonites under the leadership, with Israel under the leadership of Joshua when they were marching to the Promised Land. And because of this, we will step back to Joshua chapter 9 and try to see what happened. Israel was on its way to the Promised Land, led by Joshua. Then several kings in the area got together. They banded together to fight the Israelites. But the Gibeonites did not. They decided to make peace with Israel. They sent a delegation The delegation realized though that in order to secure a peace treaty with Israel, they have to have come from a far place. If they presented themselves as neighbors, then Israel probably it won't be worth making a peace treaty with them. But if they are from a far distance, where they are most likely they are not likely to be a threat to Israel, then the Israelites might be more willing to make a peace treaty. So their delegation pretended to be traveling from a long distance. They took tattered clothes, they took broken wineskins. We'll see the details in the Bible, but they disguised themselves essentially to create the impression of having traveled over a long distance. And they, in fact, when they requested a treaty, they told Israel that they were coming from a long distance. Let us read about this in Joshua chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. Now, when all the kings west of the Jordan heard about these things, those in the hill country, in the western foothills, and along the entire coast of the Great Sea, as far as Lebanon, that is the kings of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, they came together to make war against Joshua and Israel. However, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. The men put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us." So the Gibeonites, looking tattered and dressing themselves to look like people that traveled over a long distance, they came to Joshua and the Israelites and requested to make a treaty. They said that, they in fact claimed that they came from a distant country and that they heard about the God of Israel, that they have a lot of respect for the God of Israel. And because of their respect, that they were sent to seek a treaty with the Israelites. They showed them their moldy bread and cracked wineskins and worn-out clothing and said, "You see, when we got this bread, it was warm, and now it's all dry and moldy because we traveled a long distance." Let us read about this. Joshua chapter 9, verses 7 to 13. The men of Israel said to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live near us. How then can we make a treaty with you?" "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you and where do you come from?" They answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. And our elders and all those living in our country said to us, 'Take provisions for your journey. Go and meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Make a treaty with us.' This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you. But now see how dry and moldy it is. And these wineskins that we filled were new, but see how cracked they are, and our clothes and sandals are worn out by the very long journey." So the people claimed they came from a long distance and they requested a treaty with Israel. Well, the Israelites looked at them and accepted their case. They looked convincing. But one thing that the Israelites didn't do was seek confirmation from God. They failed to ask God, whether they should do this or whether these people were lying to them. They didn't. They simply used human knowledge, human ingenuity, if you may call it that. They looked at their evidence and said, yeah, you are from a long distance, all right? So Joshua entered into a peace treaty with them, and then the assembly, leaders of the assembly, ratified the treaty by oath before God. The treaty basically says that Israelites will leave the Gibeonites alone. They will let them leave. The Gibeonites will become their subjects. The fact that the leaders of the assembly ratified it means this met the Israeli protocol. It was a lawful treaty. And the fact, of course, that they made the oath before God means that God, it's a promise to God as well as a promise to the Gibeonites. It's a promise to Gibeonites in the presence of God. So it has the force of a promise from God. We read this from Joshua chapter 9 verse 14. The men of Israel sampled their provisions but did not inquire of the Lord. Verse 15. Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. Well, soon after, about 3 days after, Israelites realized that they had been deceived, that the Gibeonites were in fact neighbors, that they didn't come from a far place. However, they could not attack the Gibeonites because they already made a treaty. Their treaty had the force of law, and their treaty was ratified with an oath under God. So they couldn't go away from it. They had to keep it. But they decided that, okay, all we promise is that they will leave, but we didn't say what they will leave to do. So we're going to make them wood cutters and water carriers for the entire community. And that is what the Gibeonites became. The Gibeonites accepted it. Let us read about this in Joshua 9, 16 to 21. Joshua 9 verse 16. 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors living near them. So the Israelites set out, and on the third day came to their cities, Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole assembly grumbled against the leaders. But all the leaders answered, "We have given them our oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now. This is what we will do to them. We will let them live so that wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them." They continue, "Let them live, but let them be wood cutters and water carriers for the entire community." So the leaders' promise to them was kept. Well, so we see the background here. The Israelites, when they were marching towards the promised land, were attacked by a lot of countries, but the Gibeonites sought a peace treaty, and even though they deceived Israel, they did get the peace treaty. They became Israeli subjects and did the work that the Israelites told them they would be doing, that is wood cutters and water carriers. Well, during the reign of Saul, he attacked the Gibeonites and tried to annihilate them. He killed several of them. And this was against the promise that was made to them several generations earlier. So during the time of David, famine broke out in Israel. And this famine lasted 3 consecutive years. So David consulted with God and was told, yes, it is because of the Gibeonites. Saul broke the treaty with them. Saul violated the treaty. So now, and God told David that he had to take care of it. It's between Israelites and the Gibeonites. You have to appease the Gibeonites. So David consulted with the Gibeonites to determine what he could do to appease them. The Gibeonites demanded 7 male descendants of Saul as sacrifice. They said, okay, Saul did this to us, give us 7 male descendants of Saul so that we can kill them and expose their body. Let's read about this in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 3 to 6. David asked the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? How shall I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance? The Gibeonites answered him, we have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death. What do you want me to do for you? David asked. They answered the king, as for the man who destroyed us and plotted against us so that we have been decimated and have no place anywhere in Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed and exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one. So the king said, I will give them to you. Well, so David made a commitment to give them 7 men to be sacrificed, essentially. And these 7 men will be descendants of Saul. He spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, because he had an oath with Jonathan and needed to keep Mephibosheth alive. Then he took 2 sons of Rizpah. Rizpah was a concubine of Saul. He had 2 sons for Saul, so these 2 sons were taken. And then 5 sons were taken from Merab, Saul's daughter, the first daughter that Saul at some point wanted to use as a trap for David, but David didn't marry her. The 7 were handed over to the Gibeonites, and they killed all 7 and they exposed their bodies on a hill. Let us read about this, 2 Samuel 21, verses 7 through 9. The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. But the king took Ammoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Aiah's daughter Rizpah, whom she had borne to Saul, together with the 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Meholatite. He handed them over to the Gibeonites, who killed and exposed them on a hill before the Lord. All 7 of them fell together. They were put to death during the first days of the harvest, just as the barley harvest was beginning. Well, so the 7 of them were killed and their body was exposed on this hill. Then Rizpah, the mother of the two boys or 2 men, went to the hill, put sackcloth on a boulder, a rock formation, and there she stayed. She stayed there from the beginning of harvest until the rains came, which means she stayed there throughout the harvest season, several months. And her her duty was she protected the bodies. She didn't let the birds attack them. She didn't let wild animals attack them. What she did, we'll find, is very significant. But I believe she did it because of her two children. She just wanted honor for the bodies so that later on they could be buried. But the way she stayed there, day in, day out, night in, night out, for several months of the harvest season, showed a lot of devotion. And we learn something very important from that about protecting your sacrifice. First, let us read the details from the Bible, 2 Samuel 21, verse 10. Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock. From the beginning of the harvest till the rain poured down from the heavens on the bodies, she did not let the birds of the air touch them by day, or the wild animals by night. Then David was told about what Rizpah did, and David was deeply touched, and he himself learned a lesson from it. He realized that the bodies needed to be buried, but not only the bodies of Saul and Jonathan. When Saul and Jonathan were killed in the war at Mount Gilboa, the battle of Mount Gilboa, the Philistines took their body and exposed them the same way. Then the people of Jabesh Gilead went in the night and retrieved the bodies, cremated them, and buried their bones. So David went to Jabesh Gilead and retrieved the bones of Saul and Jonathan. Then buried them in Saul's father's tomb. Saul's father was named Kish, so he buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan in Kish's tomb. Then he gathered the bones of those that were exposed and buried them properly. And as soon as he finished the burial, God answered prayers and the famine was lifted. That's the famine ended. Let us read about this, 2 Samuel 21 verses 11 to 14. When David was told what Aiah's daughter Rizpah, Saul's concubine, had done, he went and took the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead. They had taken them secretly from the public square at Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them after they struck Saul down on Gilboa. David brought the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from there, and the bones of those who had been killed and exposed were gathered up. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father Kish at Zelah in Benjamin, and did everything the king commanded. After that, God answered prayer in behalf of the land. Well, what did we learn from this? The first thing is about promise. Israelites had to honor the promise they made to Gibeonites, even though it was several generations before. The promise was made during the time of Joshua, but the matter related to it arose during the time of Saul, and but had to be taken care of during the time of David. This is because God honors promise. Therefore, when you make a promise in the name of God, really any promise you make you're making in the name of God. So when you make a promise, especially if you invoke the name of God in making a promise, then that is like a promise from God, and you have to fulfill that promise. You have to fulfill it exactly the same way that God will fulfill a promise that He made to you. So the promise that Israelis made, the treaty they entered into during Joshua's generation, was binding on David's generation. The promise was made on behalf of Israel, so as long as Israel exists, that promise exists. The second thing we learn is about Rizpah standing guard over the bodies to protect the bodies against scavengers. Essentially what she was doing was she was preserving a sacrifice. These people, killing them was like a sacrifice to atone for Israelites breaking the treaty with the Gibeonites. So the lesson there is that when you make a sacrifice, you have to guard, you have to make sure, you have to do what you can to ensure the sacrifice gets to the intended objective. This motivated David. David learned this lesson immediately, and he was able to take the bones of Saul and Jonathan and guide them to their final resting place. These had been forgotten, they were left where the people of Jabesh Gilead buried them. But he realized, because of the actions of Rizpah, that they need to get to their destination, which is take the bones and bury them in their final resting place. And as soon as David did this, God responded positively because it was the proper thing to do. It was the right thing to do. But this is not just about burying bodies. It's really about sacrifice. It's about contributions. It's about whenever you make a contribution, you are really making a sacrifice because you are giving up something in order to make a contribution somewhere. Then you need to pay attention to the needs, to the objective of the contribution, and be committed to bringing that objective to fruition. You may not be the person, you are after all you are making is contribution, so it's not all up to you alone to take that contribution to its ultimate objective, but you should play your role. You should do what you can do to make sure that the objective of the contribution is accomplished. If you just throw in your contribution and say, okay, I hope these people leave me alone and make contribution, well, if they leave you alone, then actually you got your reward. You sold whatever you gave them in order to buy peace from them. So that should not be the attitude. The attitude when you make a contribution for something is to understand what that contribution is for and be committed to that objective in your heart. And then guard your sacrifice, guard your contribution. That is, do what you can to ensure that it gets to its ultimate objective. If you are trying to help somebody, provide the help and guard this help, that is, provide it in such a way that it can actually accomplish the reason why you are providing it. Don't just throw it in and then leave it to the dogs, because if that lady left the bodies there like every other person, the birds would have eaten them, wild animals would have carried them off. So scavengers. The same way when you make a sacrifice, when you make a contribution, don't leave it to scavengers. Do it in such a way that it can actually accomplish the intended objective. And stay on guard. Staying on guard may mean praying for it, praying for the people that you made a contribution to see that what you have given them can be used to accomplish the objective for which you made a contribution. Today's Bible study is a short one, and we have come to the end of it. And we pray that what we have said this night will provide a lesson that will make a positive impact on the lives of those that will participate in this Bible study sometime in the future. We pray that what you hear will give you ideas on how to help other people and bring you closer to God's objective for your life. Thank you for listening. God bless you.